Salut tout le monde. Voilà, très bien. Je vais parler en anglais maintenant, c'est bizarre. Do we have any humans in the audience, please? Raise your hands. So I want you to look around to the people who did not raise their hands. So we got a few aliens in the room. I'm an alien too. I come from a planet called Montmartre. Although I spend a lot of my time in Florida for reasons that make absolutely no sense to anyone except me. And that alien name that I was given is this name. And for most people who speak English or non-French, it's hard to pronounce. So I made a little guide. It goes like this. You say oh, like oh, and then Lee, like Bruce Lee. V, I don't know. I don't have nothing. Like it's almost like wine. And then yay at the end, and you're happy, and then you remember, oh, you're in Paris, this is awesome, I can get drunk, it's amazing, and it's cheap. This is the name I go by on the internet, and my mom likes it, and this is why I don't go by Oliver, even though that's easier in the US to order coffee. And for the past 6 years, I've been developing, maintaining, upgrading and securing Contextual.com, which is the place that brought you Rails for Zombies, if you know what that is, the version of Try Ruby with the Why the Lucky Stiff cartoons and chunky bacon, and a few too many jingles for otherwise incredibly well-produced interactive technology courses. Sadly, on June 1st, so 28 days ago, Code School went away forever. Some of the great things we built over the years are going to be living in a different form on the Pluralsight website, which acquired us 4 years ago. And many of the good people of Code School are working hard to bring back the same kind of interactive technology learning for people who love that. But still, that's sad. Today I'm going to talk about mistakes. So we have made, at Code School specifically, me personally, a lot of mistakes throughout the years. And it's hard to admit those mistakes, but it's often harder to understand how you managed to make a mistake. Like, why did it happen? How did it happen? How did you end up here? Why are you so sad? Especially without feedback. So like the way that I kind of picture this, oh, I'm hiding you the bottom, so. Is that you make a mistake, and then there's far away in the distance, there's the recovery from that error that you're encountering. And it's really hard to reach, it's really tall, and you can't, you could climb that, but it's hard. With feedback, it becomes a little bit easier to grapple your way back to recovery. But it's not perfect. It's still hard. Like, you're still smaller than that, and it's really hard to climb. If you add context to the equation, it becomes a lot easier. It's more accessible to get back to recovery with the proper context, some good feedback, and then you're good. So one problem is that we have this thing that we work with every day. We often don't understand why computers are so easily displeased with us. They scream weird shit at us all the time with error codes and things like that, and we react by asking, but why? Why us? And yet, despite the fact that we spend every day talking to computers trying to get them to stop being angry at us, we constantly get pissed at users when they dare stray away from the happy path. And one of often the most interesting questions to ask when something goes wrong when you're working with software are not why, but what, how, when, and where. So we can back up a bit once we know that these questions are the actual important questions. First of all, what is an error? So I like to go to definitions to make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about. So an error has not great definitions. So the spelling errors, it could be an error in judgment. It could be being wrong in conduct or in judgment. And in our field, more specifically, a technical error is a measure of the estimated difference between the observed value and the true value, which could be simplified by, in computer speak or programmer speak, as this is not equal that. But I really like etymology because I used to be a linguistics person, and I love to know why words are a certain way. And the word error comes from the Middle English error, which comes from the Latin error, This is not very useful. I don't know why they added a U there, which means wondering about. I love that. Wondering. Yeah, it's so much friendlier. Like you're walking around in a little forest, and you don't know quite where you're going, but you'll get there eventually, right? That's just, you just lost a little bit, like a Parisian trying to get somewhere on time. And we turned that word into this super hostile error. Like just this, it sounds bad, it feels bad, it's red instantly. It's like a build failing. So we want to stop making mistakes, but of course it's impossible to stop making mistakes. And working on behalf of users who are our focus, often we refer to them as end users, which is weird because it almost sounds like we're trying to end users, like we want to get rid of them for good, so we can just write software for ourselves. We are the middle users, not the middle-aged users, but the people who stand between the robot and the users that we think of as children, right? Often. And so as middle users, between the start users and us and the end users, we are kind of like the buffer between the computer, the machine, and the users we're trying to service. And that user, end user over there, is kind of running across the streets and not looking and clicking on buttons too fast, so that breaks our JavaScript sprinkles all the time. Nothing works in our test because they're clicking too fast. And he's not even wearing a coat. Occasionally, the start user, which could be our languages or frameworks, operating systems, decides to yell at our defenseless little end user by throwing incomprehensible words and codes at him. And I said decide as if the computer just has a mind of its own, but really we dropped the ball, us, the middle user, and we gave Papa Roomba over here a little too much power over the people that don't understand what he's talking about. So we intervene. We put on our fancy error handling badge, and maybe even a helmet because he's got really scary pinchers. And then we thwack the start user with some justice. But really, it's not the end users who suffer from confusing error feedback that either isn't appropriate or just plain hard to understand based on context. It's also us. It's also the middle user. So while we want to make things easier for the end users, we also have to build it for us. So the kind of things that confuse people in the real world are like credit card chip readers that start beeping for no reason when you've typed the right code and they just keep beeping for you to do something. It seems like something went wrong, but it didn't. Or for us, it would be Postgres or Ruby or Sass or C extensions that growl every time you try to install them and you don't quite remember why they're pissed at you again for some reason. So here's a little story. A few years ago, I started noticing strange exceptions popping up in the call sites for some methods that we had recently refactored in our code base. The most common one was argument error. So let's take a method called explode, which takes a single code argument and then just puts the string. You call the method without an argument, you get an argument error, wrong number of arguments, given 0, expected 1. So far, so good, right? That makes sense? Everybody's used to this? Now, the backtrace is useful also because it tells you, the first line is showing you where the method errored, what happened at what point exactly. Then when you check the first line of the code that you wrote, you can see clearly that you said, you should send me an argument, and you didn't. Makes sense. Now, if you call the explode method again with an argument past this time, it works, everything's fine, we're good. Now, let's say our team refactors this method to make its interface more explicit without knowing the method definition and just puts a code argument that becomes a required keyword argument. That's why there's nothing after the colon there. So the only change in this code base is 1 colon. Now, if you try to call that method without an argument, right there, you get a missing keyword code error. It tells you exactly what's missing, that code argument, keyword argument. Even though you've added a new requirement for a keyword argument, it's likely you have a few calls around the code base that are using the old passing a string directly without the keyword. That's not surprising. What do you expect happens when you do that? This is a real question. You can answer. Just throw out, yell it out. Keyword error? What else? But what's in the keyword error? What's the problem? You missing the keyword code? Yes? OK. This is what happens. Wrong number of arguments. Given 1, expected 0. Does that make sense to you? Did it expect 0 arguments? No. It expected 1 argument that was a keyword argument. That's clearly not true. We did provide an argument that was a string. It just was the wrong kind of argument. It was a keyword argument, not just a straight argument. So that was a weird thing. And at the time where I discovered this, I think it was like not 9 months ago, but more like a year and a half, it seemed weird, so I asked a question to the Ruby issue tracker. And suddenly, it was no time, which is a common thing that occurs when you open any kind of issue on the Ruby issue tracker. You have this gentleman over here, Nobuyoshi Nakada, that comes in out of nowhere and is the most prolific Ruby contributor, even though he's very less, not well known in Europe and in the US, has more commits than anybody else in Ruby, and just sends you a little reply like, how about this? And I just changed the argument error code in C, and I've merged that now that Mats is OK with it. And now what you get is argument error, wrong number of arguments, not 0. Given 1, expected 0 is still confusing as hell, and that's not fixed yet. But at least you're told, required keyword code. So at least you could figure out, OK, wait, I did that. The first part is really confusing still, but the end at least helps me up. And that was released on Christmas last year in Ruby 2.5.0, which I hope you're upgraded to, or thinking about upgrading to, because while it was released in December, Ruby 2.2 support ended yesterday or 2 days ago. So if you're on 2.2, you might want to get on that train. And if you're interested in contributing to Ruby or learning more about how that works to deal with the issue tracker and asking questions and helping out in Ruby, I gave a talk at RubyConf called Polishing Ruby. And you can probably find a bunch of help in this conference specifically to help you help Ruby. Now, speaking of better than before, let's talk about joy. This is a quote from Mats. For me, the purpose of life is partly to have joy. Programmers often feel joy when they can concentrate on the creative side of programming. So Ruby is designed to make programmers happy. So that's just a mantra of the Ruby community or the Ruby language itself. And I like to look at other communities also, because while we've pioneered a lot of focus on developer happiness, we're not the only ones who do it. There's other communities that do it now. Rust is one of those. So here's a Rust error that I found on the internet one day. Cannot find time neuromancy in the scope. Did you mean necromancy? Well, one thing that's cool about this is that not only is this saying oh, well, I have a type, it's almost like this type that you want, but it's telling you exactly where you did the mistake. So you don't have to wonder where that was or sift through your code to figure it out. Elixir has really impressive compile time errors where, first of all, there's a ton of detail. Just compare, this is not a backtrace. This is actually the error message. Oh, well, I expected a thing and you didn't have it. For example, you should try this. There's also a syntax sugar that's easier, basically a book. Also, Elm errors are probably the most impressive I've ever seen. This one is like a work of art to me. Just you don't have to see specifically or read exactly what it says. We'll get back to it. But this is, to me, the benchmark of what an error in a programming language could be. In Ruby itself, back when Ruby 2.3 was released, the inclusion of the did you mean gem, which uses Levenstein distance to figure out whether a variable or method that you're typing is matching an existing one and tells you a suggestion. Could be a one or multiple, I think. This probably saved millions of hours of debugging every year, because you're like, there was a typo, and then you look back to the docs, or you go back in the source code and try to figure out where you went wrong. This is also an example of instant recovery. You did something wrong. There's a very easy way to fix the mistake that you've done. You don't have to look for it. So you're not handling the error, but you're recovering from it very easily. The same thing, this is basically the same thing Rust was doing. We're offering a really fast path to recovery. There's also another kind of idea, which is like contextual voodoo, this little weird highlighting thing that they do in Rust. I asked Mats at RailsConf if it was possible to do the same thing in Ruby, and apparently with the abstract syntax tree nodes in Ruby, you could do this because you'd get the column information, like exactly which column in your code, in your source code, caused the error, what was the token that caused that error. But it's not available on the exception API yet. That's something that you could do or contribute. Richard Schneeman suggested a feature like this on the Ruby issue tracker 2 years ago. So for instance, when you had a method on a line, you had 2 method calls, foo.call, bar.call, and you get 1 error message. Which one is causing the error? You don't know. It's not a big deal to figure out. You can comment one out and figure out which one, but still would save you some time to figure out who did it. And his suggestion was to highlight specifically which receiver was causing the no method error or the nil error. So first we provide context by saying this is where it happened. And then we provide feedback specifically, and you'll note that the method, the error message is actually slightly different. It's not the same kind of undefined method call for nil class. It becomes the method call is undefined on receiver nil, which is a little bit easier to parse, especially for beginners who might not know, might get intimidated by the error message. So the feedback itself, like I said, changes this kind of OK error message to this, which shows a little bit more care and clarity in what we're giving as feedback. Still, it's not the most we can do. So how you provide the error feedback matters a ton, obviously. Sadly, this feature hasn't been merged or commented on for a very, very, very long time, which is sad. But if you care, you can do it yourself. You can go and try to figure out the Ruby C APIs that we could use to make the exception class give us this kind of information. Now let's go back to this beautiful error in Elm. This is beautiful work of art here. So first, what it tells us is what happened. At the top, it tells us this is an alias problem. Context. What type of error? Where it happened in the file maze.elm. How it happened. The type alias is recursive. This is a problem. I can't do this. Also, this is your actual code in context with multiple lines, not just line number that you can go to in your editor. And also, when I expand a recursive type alias, a long explanation that doesn't assume that you know what a type alias error is going to be if you're seeing it for the first time. So you can figure out how to recover from that. And finally, at the end, it shows you exactly how you could, a naive way to recover from this. It's not probably going to fix it for everybody, but it's going to fix it for most people. And there's even a link at the bottom if you want to learn more how you can fix this. This is a 10. This is perfect. This is the best kind of error feedback. There's context. You answer the questions what, where, and then finally how to recover. This, however, is an RSpec error. And I'm not trying to harp on RSpec. This is a very common type of Ruby error in Ruby libraries. There's a gigantic backtrace, and at the very, very top, I know I made it really small. This is the error message. No method error, undefined method shall escape for specific path name class instance pointing to the lib directory. So we know what happened. And we know where it happened, but do we actually know for sure where it happened? We don't know where in the code it happened. We just know what line and what file, and we might not know the file. So we don't actually know where it happened for sure, and we don't know how it happened, so that's not helpful. And we don't know how to recover, so that's not quite as good. So that's a 5. We're doing half what we could be doing. It's unclear, the feedback is unclear, and it's too late. Here's another common exception or error that people see, especially beginners, especially people who use Ruby just because they want to use a tool that we built, but they can't install the stupid tool because they don't have the right permissions or they don't know they're supposed to use a different command to install it. So it does tell us what happened. It does tell us where it happened, but it doesn't tell us how it happened. And it doesn't tell us how to recover. The only thing it tells us is, you don't have the right permissions for this file. Cool. Now, Stack Overflow, or I guess you know how to fix right permissions. Maybe, hopefully, but that's not guaranteed. So again, it's a 5. It's not quite as good as it could be. So what's missing from these errors is a path forward, a way forward from the error back to recovery land. And you could give some resolution hints. So here's an example of something that I think Raphael showed me yesterday. This is the little gem called extended bundler errors. When you install it, instead of getting these horrible bundler errors when you're trying to gem install something that has a system dependency like ImageMagick, this horrible feedback is just dumping the log, the makefile log, becomes this. So from this to this. Our magic could not be installed. What is the problem? Compatible versions were not found on your system. What could you do? One of these three things. Also, if you really want the logs because you know what you're doing, you can find them at the bottom. Even better, they have in the source, in the GitHub repository, they have common, like for all the gems that usually cause these errors, there's templates for how to just answer these questions. So instead of constantly answering, oh yeah, V8, yep, you have to do this, or Stack Overflow, just document this and either make sure that at some point Bundler does this by default, or just tell people to install this thing. So there's an exception and there's an action to be done to recover from that action. Another example that you mentioned, like Raphael yesterday, was this actionable error idea that's experimental right now. Someone's trying to get that into Rails, maybe. So it's a new kind of like extension of the exception class that gives the exception class itself a way to actually fix the problem. For instance, if you get a migration error, you would have a path to an actionable error controller that would run the migrations for you rather than tell you, hey, you haven't run the migrations. So basically, it's a big fix error button. If we can fix it, we do it for you. There's no reason to just throw a big feedback at you. So Justin Searles did something when we were talking about this talk back in the day. A library or application not having a functional need to rescue a possible error doesn't mean that it grants us the license to ignore how confusing the error might be for the person who first sees it or ultimately sees it. Because you might not need to deal with it, but the people eventually will have to. So that's true for libraries, so it's true for maintainers and the users of those libraries. It would be really nice if we were like localized our exceptions and made them more context sensitive in the context that we're in, even if we're not responsible for them, knowing that there could be an exception from a dependency that we're using inside of our libraries or even inside of our applications. For the languages, it's something that the implementers and users could benefit from if we had better like turn-by-turn contextualization where this happened, and this is why you ended up here. So there's lots of work to do. And in the C-Ruby implementation, there's a lot of those error classes that you can look at in the C code to see how the flow, how the conditionals work, and how we end up with the feedback that we get to try to pinpoint exactly what went wrong, for instance, for the argument error. And I don't mean to start a fight with that one, but this, to me, is the easiest target for improvement in the Ruby language. So it's easy to forget that your job is to create the new and exciting errors of tomorrow. Especially when these kinds of library and language level feedback things don't help you to provide good feedback. But anyway, I just wanted to give you a perspective on this. So once again, you should think of something going wrong as there was an error, the error caused a failure, and then there was an exception. It's not just stuff went wrong. And if we think about it that way, I think with the framework of that context, the feedback, and then getting to recovery as quickly as possible, I think we can make it a rule to take better care of our exceptions. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Olivier.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Oh, je t'en prie.
Des questions? Des remarques? Des choses pas claires? Questions? Oui, très bien.
I just want to point out, this is Jenna who didn't want to answer questions, and she's right. You should not ever answer questions.
I'm wondering what you think about rescuing exceptions in our own applications to provide more context. Some people feel like you shouldn't rescue exceptions that come from another library. What do you think about it?
Well, if that library is providing really good exceptions, right? If it's not throwing you under the bus, I think of an example of REST client for there's Stripe the Stripe gem is a great example for me. Like if there's a REST client exception talking to the Stripe API, it's Stripe's problem. It's not the REST client's problem. There just happens. It's kind of like when Slack goes down and Slack, like if Slack went like, oh, it's not us, it's AWS. Sorry, like we're not responsible. Like you are responsible if you're using it. It's a vendor that you took in, right? It's like you signed that contract basically. So I think if it's good, maybe it's a very descriptive error. You might not need to, but it might be very confusing for someone to receive a REST client error if they have no idea that you're using REST client under the hood. And I like just at least wrapping it, I think would be a good idea. Thank you.
I really like the.
Oh, you got.
I really like the new exceptions that you. Yes.
Get
Listen.
So people can see you.
I really like the new exceptions that you are demonstrating there. Is there anything you can bring forward in a gem, or is it just way too low level?
No, you could do a lot in a gem. Like a lot of these things, like the bundler error stuff. There's a lot of these things, like little. I think people do that for bundler a lot, just to make it nicer. So one of the things I recently talked about in a blog post was why bundler won't bundle when you tell it install something. It just doesn't, right? So there's a way you can actually see why it's not doing something. And Joe Masti wrote a gem called bundle extensions or bundle stats, where you can, I added a little piece in there where you can ask bundler, why are you not upgrading? Why are you not installing this gem? And it tells you, oh, I have all these requirements, and this one's too low, so I can't install the gem you want me to install. That's just a step. And after you do that, of course, then you can convince Ruby, Rails, bundler contributors or maintainers to, this is obviously a good feature that we should have. Like, did you mean in Ruby to me as the door to push through, basically? Like, if this was useful, such a tiny little thing, imagine what it would be if we just show, like just showing the side-by-side before, after for the gem error. Like, you're convinced, right? I mean, why would you go back to the thing where it's just like a bunch of makefile errors?
And I guess a follow-up question: if, like, I think that looked terrific. I'll go and vote for it. More generally, it sounds like your open source committee who's committing or trying to commit to the trunk. Would you think that maybe releasing this as a gem first and then watching everyone do the uptake might convince them to bring it in faster?
That's sometimes the preferred, I think, path. Like they want to see what you've done, right? If it works, if it's useful. But also, you could just start a conversation, right? So there's some Ruby core contributors, there's some Rails core contributors. Ask them questions, not like assuming they have the time to do what you want to do, but just like, I have this idea, do you think it makes sense? Here, the most common thing that I do for things like this is like, I say it on Twitter, and if people say it's stupid, probably it's stupid. Like, it's just like, say it out loud, like in a room like this, and people go, well, actually, there's a good reason it's not like that. And then if there is a good reason, everybody goes like, yeah, why don't we have that? Then you're building consensus, right? You're building like, you feel like, oh, this is not such a bad idea after all. So I think you could even skip the gem like individual thing if it's such a simple fix, such a good idea that you can convince someone to help you submit it. I'm scanning them. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier.